Among those whose knowledge of obscure esotericisms didn't constitute the greatest bulk of their essential being, it went by the more pertinent moniker of the spinning minor knots, or Sminx, theorem. It essentially held that, since 99.9999% of all life that had ever sprung forth had gone extinct, and that circa that same proportion of their collective efforts had ended likewise, it would stand to fairly elementary reason that a similar ratio of their thoughts and ideas should be little more than aesthetic variations on a comparatively narrow bandwidth of successful molds, like a series of knots folded a countable infinity of ways, only a finite percentage of which being actually functionally distinct. That was an excerpt from my presently in production Discord fantasy story, Felix Venators, or Happy Hunters. It's a long story, but the reason I mention this particular part in this context is to help illustrate for you the core concept that I need to get across in order for you to grasp what I mean by the video's title. We know that circa 99.999% of all life that's ever existed on Earth has gone extinct. 99% of entrepreneurial endeavors fail. 60% of all humans, or thereabouts, have failed to reproduce. For thousands of years, until the advent of modern medicine, 40 to 50% of humans born didn't live to see their 10th birthday. Do you see a pattern here? To help clarify it even more, here's a continuation of the previous excerpt. The soul is to the mind what the genome is to the body, Wolf's old mentor had once pronounced. And just as in our own personal evolutionary course, the commonmost element in nature is failure. The goal of all life is death, and the end of all things is entropy. As above, so below. As within, so without. As the soul, so the universe. Though it has rules, life isn't a game or a race. It's not a question of who wins, but who finishes last. Evolution has no design, no end state, no finish line. There is no morality or ethics involved in this process. Only hard, unassailable facts. That which can succeed at a given moment will thrive. That which cannot will perish. It's just the way of things. My point is, the old engine had growled when a younger, more impatient wolf pup had started growing impudent to his sensei's tireless lecturing. Don't go thinking that you being immortal means you're excused from the natural order. It does not. You and I are as much a part of the omnibus regis as anything else, and as such, you must be mindful of how and where you set your feet or how hard you flap your wings, for unlike most, you will actually live to see the consequences of those actions, both the good and the ill. But even more direly, my young pupil, you must pay careful mind to the ripples and eddies of your heart and your soul. For though your flesh be so changed, you are still your father's and mother's son. If your omnivex will should ever falter, should you collapse your true form, should you ever break from your quintessential mold, your eternal life shall be thenceforth forfeit. Just as all things in nature, people live, we fight, we die, but we also can learn. That which fails the test of experience gets washed away in the imperious currents of evolution. There is no emotion in this process. No morality, no arbitrary prejudice or bias, just cold, hard facts. Can you survive and replicate yourself? If yes, then you're golden. If not, then you're history. If you're lucky. One of my earliest video essays outlined my seminal theory of everything that I've since chosen to rebrand the Corpus Apostatrix Rex, or body of the apostate king, mostly because it sounds way cooler, but also because it lays out what I believe is the fundamental basis for the human condition. And this is all relevant to my point, so just bear with me. At its heart, we, as in humans, have two primary motivators, two prime directives, if you like. First is what I've elected to call the procreative instinct. It says in gist, do all that is within your power to survive long enough to procreate yourself. Second, equally as important but more frequently overlooked, is what I've dubbed the reductive instinct, which basically says, spend no effort on things which don't facilitate your own survival and/or procreation. Now, the reason I call this the procreative and not the reproductive instinct is the same as why I read you that bit about souls and knots at the beginning. I recently, at time of writing this script, released the first of my How to Build Super Soldiers series. In it, I drew an admittedly arbitrary definitional line around the concept of life as a complex system that's autonomously sustainable, maintainable, and replicable. And in the comments, someone, rather sensibly, took issue with my definition, arguing that certain strains of proteins or mitochondria should also be considered living since they technically meet my above standards. After a brief back and forth on the matter, we ultimately concluded, although not in these exact words, that the difference between a life form and a machine, like a car or a motor, is ultimately a question of leveled complexity. How complex does a system need to be before its reactive motor complexes constitute a living entity? Personally, I stand by my argument from back then that the fundamental difference between life and non-life is the ability to autonomously facilitate its own replication, by which I mean it has the ability to produce recognizable copies of its essential structural patterns. And by recognizable, I mean that a comparative link between the parent and its progeny can be reasonably inferred via a casual observation, i.e. you can look at the latter and, on sight, be reasonably expected to realize that it's a product of the former. But, you may argue, many children don't look or act anything like their parents. To which I'd counter with the observation that DNA-based paternity tests were only invented in 1984 and weren't widely adopted until the late 90s. And even still today, they're not the standard operating procedure at birth for some reason. Also, DNA-based analysis has shown that even when children are raised essentially from birth by parents who aren't their biological progenitors, the preponderance of resemblance to the adoptive parents vanishes by the time they're done with puberty. So yes, biology is absolutely deterministic and exceedingly influential. But that's not the point I was making by bringing up the subject of genetic lineage, nor is it to segue into yet another tirade about how the end is nigh because our birth rates are collapsing. It is, and they are, but that's not what I meant by the title either. In another video of mine several eons ago talking about the then still very much nascent potential of artificial intelligence, I outlined what I believe to be the difference between a generative and a truly creative mind. I'll admit that video wasn't my best work, even by my own then rookie YouTuber standards. However, I stand by my point that, throughout most of human civilized history, civilization has called upon people to sacrifice their individual merit and agency on the altar of our collective survival, and that from this necessity sprung forth a paradox that has vexed our species from the swaddling years in the Fertile Crescent all the way through to the modern day. On the one hand, our core imperative is to leave a mark upon the universe which clearly says to all who come after, I was here. However, our survival imperative dictates that we should work cooperatively with other humans, ipso facto sacrificing a portion of our individual essences for communal cohesion, and thereby achieving a collective strength orders of magnitude greater than any we could achieve alone. The problem is that, for this to satisfy the need for individual legacy crafting, there needs to be a unified vision for our collective project. That's where things like religion and culture come into play. Now, I've spent at least 3 whole other videos dissecting this aspect of our human condition in graphic detail, so I'll give those mental muscles a rest for the time being. However, the point that's worth drilling in is that this equilibrium between collectivist totalism and individualist singularity can only reach so far. Similar to how when a star's nuclear furnace stops generating sufficient fusion energy to resist the inward pressure of gravity, only to then be supercharged by the subsequent collapse of all matter therein into a final fatal blast that briefly outshines its parent galaxy, a civilization which grows to unsustainable proportions experiences a period, a moment of unimaginable creativity and violence before being inevitably shattered and strewn across the interstellar winds by its own dire momentum. And this boom and bust cycle has continued for pretty much as long as humanity's been at this whole civilization thing. But here's where human society differs from the rest of nature. I've said many times before that capitalism is just economic Darwinism, and it is. But the key difference is that, unlike the wolves or the deer, who remain enslaved to their biological provisions and instincts to fulfill their procreative imperatives, humans have the ability to break past our natural limits through our technological innovation. The discovery of fire, for example, enabled people to gain as much as 50% more calories from the same piece of food, effectively doubling the efficiency of their hunts. The invention of agriculture and husbandry made it so we didn't have to go chasing after our every meal. Now a single herder could provide as much nutritional substance for his village as a 10-man hunting party. Later invention, like the plow, enabled a single person to till as much in one day as 10 men could have done in a week using the more primitive hand tools. The castle magnified the prowess of a defending force. The winch and pulley and lever and wheel gave one man the effective work potential of 100. The pump enabled someone to move in 1 hour more fluid than 10 men with buckets could move in a day. I could go on for years, but you get the idea. Each step along the technological ladder multiplied the effective powers of a few, while taking another slice out of our need for mass collectives, though paradoxically exponentially increased the need for popular consensus. Circling back to my mentioning of AI a few minutes ago, what separates a generative algorithm from a truly creative one is that the former can only repeat what has been done, while the latter, being an evolutionary step above, can autonomously configure novel patterns. Think of it like this. Imagine an assembly line. Though complicated, in a vacuum a factory would be functionally no different to a bacterium, ceaselessly consuming resources, producing near-identical copies of a former pattern, never stopping, never deviating.
like a domino line, each step preceding the last with relentless accuracy and precision. A factory, like a motor, can never change, never evolve, never adapt. Its mechanisms are static, its movements refined but predictable. An algorithm, when you get right down to it, is nothing more than a hypothetical if-then statement. For example, if A equals 1 and B equals 2, then by the terms of their relationship, I'll lay the plus sign in between, then C must equal 3. This is what an AI does. It compiles and then reorders, restructures, and reconfigures existing patterns into other existing patterns. And therein lies its fundamental limit. It cannot generate that which it has seen no example of. For instance, there's a YouTuber who tried to have an AI draw for him a picture of a wine glass full to the brim. But no matter how he phrased it, no matter how many times he clarified or reworded the request, the image never came out as intended. He even once said to have the glass be spilling liquid out over the brim, and the AI drew it sloshing out through the side of the glass. So what went wrong? Quite simple. Have you ever seen a wine glass full to the brim? Probably not. Why? Because that's not how people usually fill wine glasses, at least not on purpose. And since the AI had no pre-existing examples to draw from and lacked the imagination to make up the difference, try as it might, it could not do what it was being asked to do. This is where true creativity comes in, and it's where perhaps the most controversial thing I'm going to say in this video at last enters the frame. If your contribution to the world and to society can be replicated by an algorithm, then you're not a creator, you're a generator. Going back to the aforementioned equations, imagine now that we add 1,000 variables to either side. Now imagine that each of those variables is described by another algebraic equation, and that nested within each of those equations is a similar nest of descriptive equations, and on for at least 10 consecutive generations. Now you have at least an inkling of the gulf of matrix density between an industry and true creativity. Comparing the two is like comparing the whole of evolutionary biology to a single assembly line, and that's why the vast majority of people appear to be so simple-minded. Throughout all recorded time, the bulk of humanity has been workers and breeders, not artists or philosophers. Throughout the course of recorded history, society has selected out the true creatives, as they would have been disruptive to the generative fashion of industry. We needed people to work, to build roads, to make horseshoes, to lay bricks, and make babies. For without these things, our societies and our species as a whole could not continue. But now, thanks to advancements in automation, these generative persons are increasingly finding themselves outmoded. This is why I say that 90% of us, at least, will not survive the next century. Not just our physical selves, but our legacies. And not just those of us as individuals, but of our families, our cultures, and our societies. And for a majority of these dysfunctional, dystopian, neoliberal enterprise states, I say good riddance. But I implore you, dear listener, to think on the ramifications this mass extinction event and all the consequences the myriad social and technological developments which helped spur it on will visit upon the antecedent generations. To give you a brief taste of what I'm on about, take for an example the dichotomy between ancient Athens and Sparta, the city of thinkers versus the city of soldiers. Now, ask yourself why it is that pretty much everything we associate with the ancient Greeks, almost 4,000 years post-mortem eorum, come to us via the former, and none of the latter remain but a few heavily exaggerated, if nonetheless inspirational, tales. Of course, the technology could also just as easily be usurped by the witless great worms down below, and they'll devour us all just to keep their Philistine egos from getting shattered by the inevitable fall. But what do you think? Have I taken a long step off of the cliffs of insanity, or have I stumbled my way onto Sheogorath's throne of madness? And more pertinently, which side of the great filter do you think you'll find yourself on? Leave all these thoughts below, and don't forget to leave a like and subscribe while you're at it. Become a member either here or on Patreon. Check out my books or merch store. Join me over on X, Rumble, and Odyssey to help get me off of YouTube's leash. And until next time, my friends, as always, stay safe, stay sane, and remember, the way is always open to those whose eyes are ready to look. Peace be upon you.